Hi, my name is Jennifer Evaz. Let's get equipped in the supernatural. Hello everybody, my name is Jennifer Evaz and thank you for joining us once again. We're talking about inner healing and deliverance, and today we're going to address trauma. That's something that impacts you, spirit, soul, and body. We really need to understand this better because God is doing a healing work in this area specifically. Check out my interview today with a spirit-filled therapist. Her name's Anna Alvarez, so just sit back and enjoy. Hey everybody, I have a special guest with me today. This is Anna Alvarez. And Anna, why don't you just tell everybody who you are, what you do? Give us a rundown of your life right now.
Yeah, so I'm Anna Alvarez and I'm a licensed marriage family therapist. I attend Harvest Church and I just help people who have dealt with some past experiences that have led to depression, anxiety, and trauma.
Okay. All right. Now, you're a Christian counselor, and we appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Tell us about how you became a Christian. Give us your backstory.
Yeah. So I was raised in the church. My parents were pastors, so but it wasn't until I was a teenager that I really learned who God was for me, and not just who God was, who my parents taught me who God was.
All right.
So experienced the Holy Spirit when I was a teenager, and that was when I dedicated my life fully to the Lord.
Right.
So being a Christian therapist is very different than being a therapist who is a Christian. So
Right. Now, I'd like to dig into that right there.
Yes.
What do you mean? What's the difference?
Because people can believe in God and, put that as part of their profile or their, what they focus on, but really do they bring Christ into therapy, and is it based on faith? And so I consider myself a faith-based therapist, but I also meet people where they're at. So I know people are on their journey in different places with the Lord. So, but I also meet with people who just don't know about God either.
Right. So you can work with both communities. Okay. So you are a marriage and family therapist.
Yes.
Why did you choose that? How did you get into that specifically?
Yeah. So I knew I wanted to help people. I didn't even know what therapy really was.
Okay.
I got a degree in general psychology. After my degree, I started working in the field, working with kids, but I saw the therapist that was working in the agencies that I was, working at, but I wanted to do that job. So I had to figure out what did that mean? And so going back to school just meant getting more equipped and getting more education to do what I felt God was really calling me for, but I had to learn what that really looked like.
Now, there's probably a lot of Christians who would want to do what you're doing. What would you tell them right now?
Yeah, I would say, get connected with somebody in your area that you can just talk to. I have people who interview me and ask me questions all the time about what I'm doing, and I'm always open to letting them know, but get connected in the field in some way. You can do things without having a license. You can work in nonprofit agencies and just seeing if this is really the field, or because it's so widespread, you could work with children, you could work with adults, you could work so many things. You have to figure out what is the population you want to work with too.
Okay, and what was the education like?
Yeah, so it was a master's in clinical psychology, and then getting a license, collecting hours to be licensed and a test.
All right, so it's quite a process, and you are trained, and they really make sure that you know your stuff before they license you.
Right. They don't just give it to anybody, and they hold you to some pretty strict guidelines. As you have a license, ethical guidelines, and it's pretty,
Yeah, I can imagine. But you would have to working with this kind of topic and population as well. So I could see that. Now, there is a word that is gaining momentum in obviously in therapy circles, but also in Christian churches and inner healing and deliverance circles. I've noticed that, and it's the word trauma. Okay, that word trauma, which is pretty much a huge subject that I've been tackling personally and getting all the dimensionality of that. So how do you define trauma? Tell us about trauma. What do you want us to know?
Yeah. So I think most of the times when we hear trauma, historically we would think of veterans going to military, coming back from the war. They experienced so much trauma, what they witnessed, and so PTSD was sort of labeled as that population
for war veterans who saw atrocities.
Yes, and experienced so many things, death all around them. And so now we know so much more. We know so much more that it is defined, basically, it's a strong emotional response to an experience. And our brain is so powerful that you and I can both experience the same thing and have a very different way to interpret it.
Right.
It is not the same thing.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
So I could be in a car accident with you. We could have the same experience, but we could leave it very differently. So I could go back into a car and I'm fine. You could be avoiding the car or trembling the moment you get inside of a car.
Or even never driving again. And I do know people
avoiding
like that.
Yes.
Right, I know people like that.
Yes.
Okay, and so that's what trauma can do. That's a potential. Okay, so trauma, basically something happens to your brain and your responses and your reactions, and at what point do you label it as trauma?
Well, what happens is that if your brain doesn't process it properly, because our brain is so powerful, it does protect us. And so if we don't process it properly and we basically connect ourselves with a certain narrative about that experience, whether it was unsafe, whether we were not good enough, depending on what the situation was. So then we connect ourselves with that belief, with that perspective, and we live that out. And so we could have that same emotional response to things that make us believe that same thing. Once we get into that again.
All right. So there are different levels of trauma, different spectrums. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So you have acute trauma, which would be maybe just like what I explained about like a car accident. A one-time situation.
Happened one time, and different levels of responses, and then there's that person who can never drive again. Trauma. All right. Acute trauma.
And it could be just maybe, it could last for a short amount of time too. It doesn't have to be a lifetime. So we have chronic trauma as well. So the chronic trauma would be something that we experience over and over again.
Meaning?
Let's say domestic violence.
So constant, because I've heard different terms. Like I've heard it as complex. Others have said complex PTSD. You're saying chronic trauma. Let's throw all the definitions and terms.
So chronic trauma could be where I experience that one over and over again. Complex would be I experience domestic violence, I experience sexual abuse. Over my lifespan, over different things over time.
So this is the first time I'm hearing that there's an intermediate trauma. There's acute, and then there's intermediate. That's like, certain span of time. Then you're saying complex, which is over your whole lifespan. Growing up or whatever.
So let's give an example for bullying as an experience. So that could be traumatizing for somebody. So if I'm in elementary school and I experienced severe bullying. And then again when I was in high school. Another time. So it's over time. And then maybe again in my workplace, I experienced bullying again. So that would be over repetitive. So then I have the complex where I experience bullying, and then I experience very dysfunctional family where, there was fighting all the time. So that's another thing that traumatized me. And then maybe later I was sexually abused. Something like that.
So different spectrums, but describing this whole thing of trauma. Which they originally started noticing with war veterans. And now they're saying, wait a minute, people in general are having a response that we saw over here. That's fascinating to me that they're pairing it together and saying it's pretty similar. So PTSD then, what is that and in connection to trauma?
Right. So we have the little traumas and the big traumas.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So the little traumas could be, I just experienced, a coach who was really, really hard on me.
Right.
And versus a big trauma, which would be maybe like an abusive situation.
Okay.
Okay. So PTSD, the way that we would clinically look at it is if it includes flashbacks.
Right.
Nightmares, experiencing those memories over and over again. You have maybe even a dissociation where you are checking out.
Okay.
And so there are certain things that you would classify.
Now let's talk about dissociation because that's probably was my main issue. Mm-hmm. So how do you define that?
Yes. So dissociation would clinically would be, they looked at it as a multiple personality disorder, kind of splitting.
Yeah.
Right. And so when it could also look like you're daydreaming, you're in another world.
Right.
And time can, like, the time span could, an hour has passed and I didn't even know it. I was in another place because your brain is protecting you from those moments that you're remembering.
And people do that all the time, not even because of trauma. They just kind of check out, for whatever reason. But when it's attached to trauma, then we've got maybe a habit.
Yeah.
Or an ingrained response.
Yeah. Your brain is remembering something. So we can get triggered with the trauma for very small things that we can't even think. A smell, somebody that looks like somebody. Right. So, and we can't anticipate those moments happening.
Right.
And so then we have the startled response and our brain goes to those moments. Even somebody who has said something.
Right.
Right. So that will trigger us to protect our brain, to protect us and want to check out.
So then therapy is to help people not constantly go into that state every time they experience life.
Right.
Right. Okay. So one more. DID.
Yes.
Okay. Is that same as dissociation?
Dissociative identity disorder.
Okay, and is that a little bit different than what we just talked about?
Well,
or is the
that
same?
would be the disorder where it's like constantly happening. That's where you get that classification, that diagnosis of that.
Okay, so is that the same as multiple personality disorder?
Well, multiple personality disorder was taken out.
Okay.
They didn't want to have that in there.
Well, these are questions that everybody wants to know, like what is what, and because they're going to try and figure out what's going on with them.
Yeah, but we do find that people do have different parts of them that will come out. So that even have names. People will show up, and you're not sure who you're talking to in the moment.
And they're not necessarily demons.
Right.
They can be actually that person.
Yes.
Well, I'll notice when we minister to people sometimes, when they curl up in a little ball and act like a little kid, that we're usually dealing with that and not a demon. Exactly. We're dealing with, they've reverted to something in their childhood. So I want to thank all of my global partners who are financially supporting this ministry as we get this message, as we advance God's kingdom across the earth through media. We have a message about the supernatural and reconciling people to the gifts of the Holy Spirit so that they can preach the gospel with confidence. Preach the gospel the way Jesus intended, and it's working. We've had so many testimonies of people finally reconciling that they are supernatural because of the Holy Spirit and actually stepping into ministry for the first time ever. If you want to become a financial partner and support this ministry, well, I want to invite you to give. Go to jenniferevaz.com and just hit the Give tab. So then, is trauma emotion? It's definitely emotional, but is it also spiritual?
Yeah. So it definitely has a spiritual component to
it. Okay, we need to hear about that because this is where I see the arguments between professional counselors and inner healing and deliverance ministers. And there's a little bit of a stretch and pull there.
Yeah. The spiritual components to it is that, trauma causes the person to see everything differently.
Right.
And so you see yourself differently, you see the world differently, you see God differently. So if I am seeing myself differently, there's a spiritual component to that, because I'm not seeing myself as the way God sees me.
That's a great, simple explanation. Okay. Does it get more complex than that?
For sure, because we open doors, right? Like,
Definitely.
there's doors that are opened when that trauma happens. If we maybe didn't put ourselves in that place of sin, but that door got opened.
Right.
So we have to notice, and we have to recognize which part of it. And so we don't over spiritualize it, but we also don't dismiss the spiritual component to it.
So is your approach then, okay, there's a lie at work here?
Yes.
And do you kind of handle it from that place?
Right, because we've begun to believe the lie.
Right.
And the enemy wants you to believe the lie.
Right.
He's determined to keep you in that sort of trap.
Okay.
And so that's where the fight is spiritually, of taking your authority.
Okay. Can you give some examples?
Yeah. So if we believe that we are unsafe because
Okay.
the trauma was based in an unsafe situation,
Okay.
it's hard for us to believe that God is our protector.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So we will just cling to that
Right.
belief that God didn't protect me in that moment. So then I am never going to live my life out. I'm always trying to strive. I'm trying to protect myself.
Going into hypervigilance, okay, these terms that, we hear in these circles. What is another example?
Yeah, so whether it could be I wasn't good enough.
Okay.
Yeah, there's these common themes of beliefs that it was my fault. I'm responsible.
Right.
And so believing these things is not aligning ourselves with what the truth that God says
Right.
in His Word.
Okay. So you basically, even if it's a complex trauma or an acute or whatever place in the spectrum, there's a lie involved. And that's where you're coming in and helping them. And once that lie is resolved, the trauma begins to heal. Is that
Right.
a pretty good picture?
That's definitely part of it.
What
There
else?
is
What else?
forgiveness.
Forgiveness. Okay. This is one of my biggest pet peeves because I have seen the presentation of forgiveness as come to the altar, forgive, and be done with it. Lacking process, and I've tried to educate people that that's a great start, but it's way more complex. That's my experience.
It's not a one and done kind of thing. No, it's definitely more complicated than that, and it's a process.
Yeah.
And we need to accept the process, and we need to be able to be okay with, okay, I may be dealing with forgiveness for the rest of my life because that is just what's happening right now. Because forgiveness goes a lot of ways. It goes with, I may have to forgive others.
Right.
People may have to forgive me. I may have to forgive God.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And of course, God forgives us, right?
Right.
So there is a lot of areas that we have to look at forgiveness.
Yeah, that's really huge. And what would you say to people that are bound to this thing where they've been told, you're not forgiven because you haven't forgiven, and kind of that push to forgive instantly, no process. How would you counsel them?
Yeah, we have to be careful with that because there's the shame attached to that.
Right.
And that I'm not a good Christian then if I didn't fully forgive.
Yeah.
And so we have to show a lot of self-compassion and grace. Not pushing, as ministers too, we can't push people to do that step. They have to be ready to do that step. And it may be slow and steady,
Right.
just keeping on, like, okay, there's sometimes when people will say, I don't even want to think about that.
Right.
I can't even consider that.
Yeah, because that's the only power they know over the situation.
Right.
So then when people start healing, they start experiencing all sorts of huge negative emotions. They're told in churches sometimes, that you shouldn't have those emotions. What would you say to that?
Well, God created our emotions.
Okay.
And our emotions definitely can steer us in the wrong direction
For sure.
because they're not always
sure.
based on facts.
Sure.
But that we need to allow ourselves to feel, because then we deny ourselves that process that we need to be able to heal.
I think it's one of the most famous statements I've ever heard come out of your mouth is you've got to feel to heal.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think we're all guilty of just trying to deny and avoid because it's more comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. So then, people with complex trauma, and you know the statistics, you know the process, what would you say to them? I mean, can they heal? Because that's what they feel like, that there's no hope.
Right.
It's so bad.
Yeah, it's a very hopeless kind of situation is what it looks like. It looks bleak. It looks like, where is the turn? And so that is really, it's a commitment to this process.
Right.
It's a huge commitment because I've seen so many people give up on the process because they maybe get just a little bit, it's enough to help them. It was better than what it was before. So then they don't continue moving forward for complete healing. And so it has to be a full commitment to the process, and you have to be a fighter.
What would you say that they need around them to support that commitment?
Yeah, so it's very important to have a team, to look at it as something that you can't do alone.
Sure.
Because we even see, things that are in the dark,
right,
have to come to the light.
Right.
And so we need to be able to do that, to say it out loud, because then shame attaches to that. So we need, you need to have a team around you, a support team. That could be just people that you can be real with, that you can reach out to help. It could be ministers. It could be a deliverance minister as well, but it could also be also professional to help you, because everybody is equipped for certain things. Not everybody can do what the other person can do to help.
So it sounds like they're going to have to make an investment, because I hear all the time, why don't you do this for free? Why aren't people there for me? And I'm thinking to myself, because it's not their job, which is sad.
Right.
It's the reality of it.
Yeah.
What happens to people who ignore trauma?
Well, when we ignore trauma, you're definitely going to see it interfere in your life.
Okay.
In a lot of the aspects.
How do we know that? Because I didn't get my memories back till I was 47 years old. And there was definitely issues that were showing up, but people ignore it, or they don't even know it's there.
Right.
So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so most of the times we will avoid it because it helps it's just more comfortable, right? But there comes a point when you can't avoid it anymore, because it's breaking relationships.
There you go.
That's one. You can't hold down a job.
Yeah, okay.
Or your job performance is suffering in some way. You are probably having some kind of emotional meltdown, whether it be irritability and anger, or just depression and you're isolating. Anxiety is just turning into panic.
That's very common. I see that probably more than anything is extreme anxiety people.
Yeah.
And they just think like that's normal, and they try to medicate it or whatever.
Right. People tend to think that that's just the way of life. It's just my life, and that's how it's going to be.
But there's a root to that. That's something happened.
Right. There are definitely coping skills, but ultimately you have to get to the root of it so to be able to be free.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from you is trauma is going to deal with you if you don't deal with it, which is one of the things that we tell people all the time in ministry settings. And how do you help somebody to get ready to deal with their trauma? Because it's the scariest thing to deal with something you could never deal with. Right.
So much love and care, because we, as a professional, we could see it. Maybe, others around you could see it, but that person has to be ready.
Right.
And it may not be at the pace that you want them, and sometimes we have to slow down. sometimes you're ready for more. Okay, let's go.
Okay.
And so you have to take it at their pace. But I think that's what's so great about this, is that not everybody's story is going to be the same.
Right.
Everybody's journey is going to be different. There's no cookie cutter. I can be, here's 1, 2, 3, go ahead and do that and you'll be fine.
Right.
Everybody's different.
Now, my personal frustration has been the pace of healing. I'm a fast-paced person, and yet healing seems to be slow, even though I'm very diligent. What can people expect? Is that normal?
You can expect that you probably are not going to be happy with the pace that it is. But one of the things I like to point out all the time is that to notice the victories, notice what is getting better.
So good.
Yeah, because there are things that are improving. What you want is it to be a 0. You want it to be no more.
Right.
But there are things that are getting better. And so you have to be able to ask the Lord, highlight the things that have improved. I haven't felt so anxious today.
Right.
I wasn't at a 10. I was, maybe at a 5. And okay, I'll take that.
Okay. Now, my last question is, using medication for anxiety or issues in the mind, what's your position on that? What would you counsel people in that regard?
Yeah. What I tell people is that I know everybody comes in with a very different perspective and mindset based on their experiences and what they've been told. I respect that wherever they're at.
Okay.
But I also know that the best form of treatment when the condition is severe is going to be a combination of medication and therapy, not just one or the other.
Right.
We can do therapy without medication. You're just going to see a slower response. Okay. And sometimes I will see the person is suffering so much that I may say, there's this recommendation. This is available. It's a resource if you want to use that. You're going to see some relief. Because that's what it is. It's a relief of the symptoms. It's not a solving of the problem.
Right.
So you can get the medication. It'll help you relieve the symptoms as we work on the things here and get to the root. Yeah, I chose to not do medication, but that was probably because I know how to master pain, probably not like other people. Yeah. It's not for everybody, but again, that was just my personal preference. Yeah. So, and I didn't feel it was pushed on me. But there is pain involved. Healing involves pain. And so that's something people are going to have to learn to deal with. What would you say? Yeah, so PTSD has the symptoms of anxiety, and anxiety has the physical symptoms. Right. And those are the things that people would describe as the pain. Right. And so that is all of the physical symptoms that somebody might be having, and typically it's in this area. Yeah. And so it's with your breathing, it's in the chest, it's in the constriction. And so that's the pain people will experience physically. Okay, all right. Well, everyone, this is Anna Alvarez, marriage and family therapist. It was really good to hear from her today.